Thank you very much for joining this webinar. It's the first one that I've done on fact versus fiction, and if it's successful, I'm hoping to do more of these webinars. So just a little bit about myself, my history. I've worked in the dental sector now for about 13, 14 years, specializing in the health and safety field. My role has been mainly involved doing risk assessments across the UK, across dental practices. I've worked for a couple of large dental corporates and externally as a health and safety consultant. So my knowledge is very niche to the dental market. And essentially, it's during that time that I've come across a lot of misconceptions or contradictions in health and safety advice. Generally, when I'm doing the health and safety assessments, people are telling me one thing, people are telling me something different. I'm getting different advices from inspectors, from contractors and all that. And it was at that time that I really established that there was some confusion out there in the practice domain. People really not quite sure what they are obliged to do and what the correct answers and responses are. So that was part of the rationale behind doing this webinar, is to try and hopefully help you understand all these different pieces of information that have been possibly fed to you, different people saying different things, different requirements. And it's just to pretty much iron all that out and be completely transparent with it, which is what I did as an assessor. I would go into practices and I would hopefully educate them onto their requirements rather than telling them you must do this and not giving them a rationale behind it. So this webinar is going to go through a few points today. I'm going to look at a couple of different topics, a couple of different areas of health and safety compliance. And as you can see on the slide now, these are the sort of questions I'm hopefully going to be able to answer or explain a little bit more about. Again, the purpose of this is hopefully that you'll go away from this webinar feeling a little bit more confident, educated, and having the ability then to have proper proactive discussions with contractors, with assessors or inspectors when they possibly query you on something like this. Okay, so I just want to ask one particular question at the moment before we run into it. And my experience is, as I've said, that people are telling me different things, and I've always wanted to understand the reasons why they're telling me these things. And I will always ask the question, why? And that's not to challenge people, that's to understand the rationale, to understand where that requirement comes from and what my obligations are. But I do find a lot of time in my experience that people will say, you need to do this, but they won't really explain it to you. And that could be as a result of them trying to force through a product that they're trying to sell, force through a service that they're trying to sell, or maybe they just don't understand it themselves and they need to be educated. So this is the reason why I've done this webinar, to enable you to have those discussions a little bit more efficiently. Okay, so these are the type of questions I'm going to be going through, and hopefully I'll answer all these for you during the course of this webinar. So, there we go. So before I go into the fact or fiction part of it, I just want to explain a couple of things that you will see as a continuity throughout this webinar. These icons will appear throughout every slide that I present, and it's important to understand what these icons mean. So the first one is a picture of a judge in a court, and this refers to any acts, orders, or regulations. These are the official rules that are passed by government, rules that we must follow to comply with laws. And if we don't comply with these acts, orders, or regulations, we will get prosecuted for failure of compliance. So everywhere you see a judge icon means that it's a statutory compulsory requirement for us to do. The next one down then, the book with the little hammer on it, this is what's referred to as an approved code of practice. So again, these codes of practices you see a lot in health and safety. They break down the statutory obligations and they put them into more user-friendly language for people to understand. However, these have a special legal status behind them. If you were breached for for health and if you're prosecuted for breach of health and safety law, and it is proved that you did not follow the relevant code of practice, you will need to show that you complied with the law in some other way, or a court will find you at fault. So the approved code of practice are there for you to follow. And if you don't follow them, they could prosecute you under that code of practice if you can't demonstrate that you've done it, that you've complied with the law in some other way. And then the last one is guidance. So there's lots and lots of forms of guidance out there. We're very familiar in the dental industry with our HTMs, in particular HTM 105 for decontamination in dental practice. We've also got British standards as well, and these are referred to a lot in health and safety law as part of our healthcare regulators. And the difference between a HTM and a British standard is they're both best practice guidance, okay? They set the rules for us to follow, okay? But we are free to take other action if we want to, okay? However, by following the guidance means that you will be adhering to the law and doing enough to comply with your statutory obligation, okay? Inspectors will therefore use HTMs and British standards and things like that as a benchmark to judge the industry against. HTMs are specific to the healthcare sector, okay? So that's why we've got HTM 105 for decontamination. We've also got other HTMs for water management, for fire safety, and that they've all been written specifically for healthcare. So it's very important that we do take these on board and follow them. Okay, British standards then, referred to a lot. These are standardized best practice guidance. They're written by industry experts and they're approved for use in the UK by the government and by the British Standards Institute. So again, the standardized approach is to enable contractors to come in to do work on our fire systems, our electrical systems, and other systems, and all follow the same standardized work to make sure that people are not doing things differently and to keep it all streamlined, essentially. Okay, so 3 icons you'll see throughout. Your judge is your statutory obligation. Your approved code of practice is something that you should follow, and if you don't, you could be found in breach of it. And guidance is exactly that. It's guidance. It sets the best practice expectations for us to take on board. So the first fact or fiction I'm going to talk about is Legionella risk assessments. Okay, so they're still out there, and I still come across this now. I came across it a lot about 5 to 10 years ago, but I'm still seeing this misconception that people think that Legionella assessments need to be redone every 2 years, and maybe they're being told that they expire after 2 years. However, that statement is actually fiction, okay? So Legionella bacteria is a biological hazard. So actually the statutory requirement for Legionella falls under COSH, the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health. This is your statutory obligation that states that you must do a risk assessment for any substances hazardous to health. And Legionella bacteria falls into that, okay? However, as you can see there with the second paragraph down, the risk assessment must be reviewed regularly. So it doesn't state the time frame, it just uses the word regularly, okay? And it's only as a result of this review, if you identify changes that need to the risk assessment, it's then that those changes must be made. So essentially, it's then that the risk assessment must be done. This is then backed up then by the Legionella disease approved code of practice, okay? Because Legionella bacteria isn't a product or a substance that you can buy off the shelf like it is with your bleach and things like that you commonly associate with COSH. It has a whole supplementary code of practice behind it to help people comply with the law and to manage Legionella bacteria as an individual hazard to health, okay? But again, within this code of practice, it mirrors the COSH regulations and states that an assessment must be carried out and that assessment must be reviewed regularly. So it uses the same wording, regularly, okay? So what's important to get from this is that assessments, they don't expire as long as they remain relevant to your business, to your practice, and to the processes that you've got in place, okay? So they don't have an expiry on them. You need to put a mechanism in place to make sure that those are reviewed and that everything within that assessment remains relevant to your practice, to your processes. Okay. So if anyone says that they expire after 2 years, that's incorrect. If anyone puts an expiry date on an assessment, that fundamentally is correct as well. You should have a review date on your assessments, and that review date should be in accordance with the level of risk at your practice. Okay. It then becomes our responsibility to make sure that that assessment, that piece of paper, is still applicable to what you've got in place. Okay. So to put this in perspective from a regulator's point of view, I've put in a few comments here, and these are taken from healthcare inspection reports. Okay, so we can see here that the inspectors are using this, and they're not looking at a particular time frame. They're not judging it on 2 years or 3 years, but they want to make sure that assessment is being reviewed and is still up to date. So the first comment there we can see is a Legionella risk assessment was available, but this was carried out a person who hadn't the qualification, skills, competence, and experience to do. So whilst this isn't about the expiry of the assessment in particular, it does highlight the need to make sure that assessments are done by someone with the experience and knowledge to do them. So essentially, that review process of the assessment has failed in this case because they haven't identified the assessment is suitable for the practice. Okay, and then we've got the middle one. So the practice of commissioning Legionella risk assessment in 2017, but this has not been reviewed since. So this statement is taken from this year. This is an inspection report from 2023. So we can see that that's been 6 years and no one's looked at that assessment. So that's what inspectors are judging against, is whether you are reviewing it regularly. Okay, and then the last one then is about recommendations in the assessment. So again, if you've had one undertaken, make sure you review it to make sure that any actions, recommendations, remedial work that's required has been acted upon. Don't just get the assessment done and leave it gathering dust up on a top shelf somewhere. Okay, make sure that that assessment is complete and has been reviewed. Okay, so just to go into this a little bit more, if you've had an assessment done by an external contractor, someone with the competence to understand Legionella in relation to the healthcare sector, they should, this is guidance, as you can see by the picture, that assessment should include an up-to-date water schematic of your system, okay? And the purpose of this is to help you with that review process. So water schematic identifies how the water travels around your practice, how it gets heated, how it moves from room to room, and it will also detail the components within that system as well. So it'll identify how the hot water is heated, whether you use a combination boiler, whether you use a hot water cylinder. It will identify all those components and list them into a very easy to interpret diagram. I've created this one that you're looking at now, and that is pretty similar to what you'll find in a competent Legionella assessment. So essentially, when you've got your assessment in front of you, your review is ensuring that that water schematic remains relevant to your practice. If you undergo a refurbishment, for example, and you move the decontamination room from the first floor to the ground floor, that is a significant change to your water system, and therefore that will trigger the need to do another assessment. But if everything remains the same, you don't do any sort of refurbishment, nothing moves within that water system, then that assessment is still applicable to your practice. So you can use those water plans in your assessment to hopefully help you undertake that review process. Okay, it is quite simple. A lot of assessments can be quite detailed in the level of information they got in them. But if you initially focus on that water diagram, that's what you're looking at. Okay, so the blue line will tell you where the cold water comes into your practice and how that gets distributed to all your outlets in the premises. And the red line then shows you where the cold water is getting heated. So in this example, a standard combination boiler, and how the water then flows from that combination boiler to your outlets. So again, this can help you with your water temperature regime as well, because I can see on this diagram that my cold water is coming in into the ground floor, and the first outlet that cold water is going to is my toilet. So in relation to your monthly temperature checks, the toilet is my nearest cold water outlet. My furthest cold water outlet would be the second floor kitchen in this example. Okay. The hot water, however, flows differently. So the hot water comes from your hot water heater, whatever that may be, whether that's a boiler or hot water cylinder. So in this example, my nearest outlet to the boiler would be surgery 3 or 4. Okay, my furthest outlet would likely be surgery 2. So again, it will help you identify the flow of water, which then links into your monthly requirements to do your water temperature checks. Okay, but going back to the review process, if you've got this in your assessment, use your water plan to identify whether there's been changes to your system, and that will then trigger whether or not you need to do a new risk assessment. Okay. So sticking with Legionella, I want to just try and talk about the temperature recording. I just mentioned on the previous slide about the monthly temperature logs, which hopefully you should all have in place and should be doing. But there is still a lot of confusion out there about what the correct temperature is of your hot water supply. And funny enough, I had a question from one of our members this morning, actually asking on this, so it came at the correct time. So I've underlined the word here that you can see on the slide, must. Must be a minimum of 55. So must is a statutory compulsory definition. If you see must in a document, you have to do that to comply with the law. Okay. However, when we talk about Legionella and adhering to the 55 degrees, it's not a must. Okay. So it's not a statutory obligation to reach 55 degrees. The statutory obligation comes from the approved code of practice, and that defines the requirement to avoid temperatures between 20 to 45 degrees. Okay, so that's your risk parameter there. Legionella bacteria will thrive within 2045, so you must avoid that temperature regime. Okay, there's also other controls that you must have in place as well. You must avoid water stagnation within your system, and you must avoid using materials within your water system that can harbor Legionella bacteria. So there's other controls, but 20 to 45 degrees, when we talk about the temperature, is your high risk parameter. Okay. However, this 55 degrees comes from guidance, and it comes from quite a few pieces of guidance as well. So it comes from HSG 274, which is health and safety technical guidance around Legionella. It comes from then 3 different HTMs specific to the healthcare sector. Okay, all of these state that hot water should be stored at 60 degrees and distributed so that it reaches outlets of 55 degrees in healthcare. Okay, the first paragraph that you can see there where it says reaches the outlets of 50 degrees, that's the HSG 274 statement. Okay, and HSG 274 applies to all sectors. So 50 degrees for sectors outside of healthcare, but it does state within that the 55 degrees in healthcare. The second paragraph there, for hot water supplies, flow temperature should be set at 60. That is from your HTMs. And each one of those HTMs that you can see references that same requirement. 60 degrees for your stored hot water, minimum of 55 degrees at all the points in the network, so all your outlets. Okay. The reason for this and the reason for difference between 50 and 55 is because we are healthcare. We deal with a lot of members of the public that come through our doors on a daily basis, and those members of the public could have various underlying health issues. Healthcare is defined as a higher risk industry when it comes to Legionella bacteria. Legionella is a potential fatal form of pneumonia. It affects people. The older you get, the more it will affect you, particularly if you're over the age of 45. It can affect heavy smokers, heavy drinkers, people with kidney, lung, heart disease, respiratory problems, and particularly people with poor immune systems. So that's the rationale with having a higher temperature in healthcare, because we don't necessarily know, even though we do our medical histories, there may be underlying health issues that we're not aware of. So we got to protect those vulnerable persons. And in the guidance that, and even in the approved code of practice, it does state about protecting people with vulnerabilities. Okay, so just to again put that in perspective from a regulator's point of view, these again are quotes from inspectors. And again, you can see their terminology here, that they're following this guidance and they're following the requirements to try and meet 55, but they're not putting it in as a statutory requirement. The top quote states this: not all the hot water temperatures consistently exceeded the recommended 55 degrees. Okay, so they're judging you based on the guidance documents, as I said at the start. They've put that in place as the expected control measure to try and achieve, but they are referencing that recommendation within the reports. So they will judge you on quite a few variables when it comes to how you manage Legionella temperatures and risks within your practice. And just to hone in on that a little bit more, I just want to try and educate you guys on the differences between the temperature regime and what's important and what's not. So essentially, I want to go back to the very basic health and safety risk assessment requirements now, okay? If you do a risk assessment, the first step of that assessment is to identify the hazard. So in this case, the hazard is Legionella, okay? Then you have to control that hazard under risk management. So just going to put up another little quick poll just to get your understanding of this, but essentially, when you do a risk assessment and you identify the hazard, what is the primary goal to manage that hazard then? You know, should you be trying to reduce the effectiveness of the hazard? Should you be trying to isolate that hazard and stop people coming into contact with it? Should you be putting in personal protective equipment to protect people from it? Should you be trying to eliminate it? So what is the correct response when you do a risk assessment? What is that primary control that you should be trying to do? Okay, so just have a think about that. The poll's up there, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, so if we look at the temperatures in 3 different brackets, okay, and correspond that to the approved code of practice and guidance, if your hot water temperature is between that 20 and 45 degrees, okay, then Legionella bacteria could be prominent within the system, within your water system, okay? You will be putting people at risk if your temperature is falling within that range, okay? It will grow, it will multiply, it will thrive within that temperature range. So you have to avoid the 20 to 45 degrees, okay? Once you go above 45 degrees then, so 45 to 55 degrees, you will start controlling the risk, okay? So Legionella bacteria can no longer thrive within that temperature regime, but it may still be present within your system, okay? It will start dying off, the bacteria, but the rate at which it dies will be a lot slower, okay? So that's quite important, and this kind of explains the temperature regime, that you've controlled the hazard because you've got above that 45 degree temperature limit, but you haven't actually got rid of the hazard because it is still present in the system, or could still be present, okay? So this then links into why they're trying to get us to accelerate our water temperatures up to that 55 and above range, okay? So Legionella bacteria cannot survive at a temperature range above 60 degrees, okay? It will die off, and it will die off very quickly, 60 and above, okay? So this is where all the guidance comes into play now. They've taken that on board, and that's what they are trying to get us to hit. They want our hot water storage cylinders, our boilers and that, to be set at 60 degrees to try and kill off, eliminate any of that bacteria within the water system. Okay, so this links back to that poll now. Your primary control when it comes to risk assessment, the very first thing you need to think about when you identify a hazard is, can you eliminate that hazard? That's the very first thing you need to think about. Before you put anything else in place, can you eliminate it? Okay, and that's what you're kind of getting judged on in this sense. Legionella bacteria is the hazard. So the very first control when you do a risk assessment is to eliminate the hazard. And that's why that 60 degrees, again, is being replicated in the guidance and the approved codes of practice, because they want you to eliminate, they want you to proactively manage the risk. Okay. So the 60 degrees refers to your hot water cylinder. If you set that cylinder or your boiler at 60 degrees, it will boil and essentially kill off the bacteria in the system. The 55 degree drop, the 55 degrees then, that 5 degree drop in temperature, is to account for the travel distance from the hot water. So if you refer back to that water schematic I showed you earlier, the water has to travel from your boiler around your practice, and it needs to get to the furthest outlet away from that boiler. Okay, so obviously the temperature of water will decrease a little bit to take account of that travel distance. So they've given you a 5 degree flexibility there. The 60 degrees is at the point that the water is heated, and that 5 degree drop then to account for the travel distances. Okay, so if you're within that range in your practice, you are fulfilling your requirements to manage risk under the health and safety management requirements. Okay, you are showing that you are effectively doing a risk assessment because you are taking on board that primary control measure to eliminate it. Okay, and then you are following all the best practice guidance out there then, which applies to healthcare. Okay, so one of the other things to consider with this is the word that they use, should. Okay, so if you hear the word must, as I explained earlier, that's a compulsory legal obligation. You must follow it, and there's no real argument for not doing it. Should is an expected measure that you are expected to follow. Okay, now there is reasons that you can show that you haven't followed that, but you would have to justify those reasons. So for example, you should achieve temperatures of 55, but your water system that you have in your practice may be struggling to meet that parameter. It may be an old system you've got, for an example, and it's struggling to cope with the capacity and the demand of the practice, and is struggling to get to that temperature regime. So you can possibly demonstrate to inspectors that you have tried to do it, but you shouldn't just ignore that requirement. And you have to be able to justify why you haven't been able to meet that top level tier of 55 degrees. Okay, if you can do that, if you've taken steps, you've been proactive to do it, but you're struggling to hit 55 and you're around about the 52, 53 mark, then you are legally still controlling the risk. You just haven't been able to eliminate it. And that controlling the risk, then inspectors will take in a broader approach, or they should take in a broader approach. And if you've been able to justify why you can't get to 55, they will then take into account other factors. They will start looking at things like how often your water system's used. Do you regularly flush through your water? Is it used on a daily basis to avoid that stagnation risk? What type of water system you've got? So again, if you've got a cold water tank or a hot water tank, that is a higher risk system. So actually, if you've got a higher risk system in your practice, there'll be more expectations for you to try and hit that 55 degrees. If you've got a lower risk system, like an instantaneous water heater, a small little unit that heats the water at the point of use, then there won't be as high as priority. Okay, so look, I just wanted to explain the temperatures, and hopefully that's giving you a little bit more knowledge on the differences between the temperatures and the rationale behind them. Okay, I hope that hasn't caused any more. I hope that hasn't confused you any more than maybe what you already were on this. But yeah, just to summarize this and put it into a nutshell, you must legally carry out an assessment to identify the risk of exposure to Legionella. So that's a statutory obligation. You must then review that assessment, but that does not mean redo if nothing has changed, okay? Water temperatures between 20 and 45 degrees that favor bacterial growth should be avoided, okay? And that's defined in the ACOP, so you should be following that to avoid potential prosecution. The same then with water stagnation, keeping the water flow in your system flowing regularly, keeping all your taps in use, especially if you've got like a surgery that hasn't been used for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, maybe the dentist has gone on holiday, then you need to make sure that all those taps are run through to get rid of that potential stagnation. And materials as well. If your water system consists of all the correct materials that are approved for use in healthcare, then again, that will minimize the risk, okay? Copper is the best material for use in healthcare. You should be avoiding plastics and leads and things like that, okay? So there's lots of controls when it comes to managing Legionella. Temperature is the primary control, but if you're struggling to hit that 55, there are other things you can do to mitigate the risk and supplement that. But you need to be able to justify why you can't get to that 55 to satisfy inspectors who will judge you to that expectation based on the fact that healthcare settings are deemed as high risk because of vulnerable persons that are likely to be present. Okay. So next topic I want to look at is pressure vessels. So a pressure vessel is a autoclave or a compressor when we look at a dental setting. Okay, so autoclaves and compressors are what I'm going to be looking at. Okay, so again, I've done a lot of health and safety risk assessments in my time. I've reviewed maintenance reports for compressors and autoclaves, and there's still been a lot of confusion over there. If I ask for an examination report, sometimes I'll get given a service report, sometimes I'll get given a validation report. There's a bit of confusion between what the differences between them. So I just want to establish what the requirements are when it comes to maintaining autoclaves and compressors. Okay, so the statement here is something I've picked up in my journey in this business. Pressure vessels only need to be serviced for compliance. So that is fiction. It's not accurately correct. Okay. So the requirement to service your equipment falls under the provision and use of work equipment regulations. Okay. This is to do with the servicing element. So a servicing element, I'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide. Okay. But this sets out the requirements to keep equipment maintained in efficient working order and good repair. Okay. So that's your primary obligation to servicing and maintenance. Okay. But you also have then a second regulation, the pressure system safety regulations. Okay. And this requires you to do something different to just servicing, something additional. Okay. When you buy a new autoclave or compressor, okay, and just to clarify, when I talk about compressors, these are larger compressors, anything over 250 bar liter. If you've got a small compressor, like generally a one surgery compressor, they will fall outside these regulations. Okay, so 250 bar liter is the threshold. Anything over that falls under this requirement. So again, it'd be good to identify actually how big your compressor is in your practice, whether or not then this obligation falls upon you. But if you have a new autoclave or compressor installed in your practice, you must have something called a written scheme of examination. Okay, and that written scheme examination must be in place before you use the equipment. Okay, it specifies the safe operating limits for the equipment, especially when it comes to the pressure levels and things like that. Okay, so you must have that in place before you start using your autoclave or compressor. That should be provided by the installers, but sometimes you would need to get in a third-party examination company in to do that. So again, when you order a new autoclave compressor, ask them whether or not they are providing a written scheme of examination with it. And if not, you will need to arrange that. Okay. Then once you've got your written scheme examination in place, that will dictate the frequency that you have follow-up examinations. Okay. And these examinations in our industry are commonly referred to as a pressure vessel inspection. Okay. So you may have heard of PVI, commonly from contractors, inspectors, regulators. Okay. So a further examination, or PVI, is the follow-up examinations to ensure that that pressure vessel is still operating at those safe limits as specified in the initial written scheme of examination. Okay. So again, inspectors, what they are looking for in this, and again, this is where you'll see their terminology. The autoclave had a PVI, so that's your examination, on the 21st of January, but there was no evidence to demonstrate timely re-examination. So there's a primary example then that they're not re-examining that piece of equipment. So that's not to do with the servicing, that's the examination, something different, okay? And also there was no evidence of a written scheme of examination in place for a compressor. So again, they've got a brand new compressor, but they haven't got the written scheme to accompany it. So really, legally, they shouldn't be using that compressor, okay? There was no evidence of periodic testing and maintenance. So that bit refers to your servicing, okay? When your PVI was completed, there was a requirement to replace a part. This had not been actioned. So again, the examination reports will dictate whether or not that piece of equipment is safe for continued use. If there is any remedial work required, you shouldn't be using that piece of equipment until they're rectified. Okay. And again, the air compressor was maintained by an independent person. However, we saw no service records. So again, the servicing element, you must keep a service log. Okay, you must be able to demonstrate that maintenance has been undertaken on your systems. Okay, so look, just to break this down a little bit further. Okay, I've always educated people on this topic, or tried to explain it in very similar to a car. Okay, so I'm going to do that with you guys now. So a service, your maintenance, is equivalent to the service of a car. Okay, it's carried out to maintain the equipment in efficient working order, and generally it will be carried out in accordance to manufacturer's recommendations. Okay, so Eschwin, for example, I know, judge the frequency of servicing on the number of cycles that autoclave has completed. Okay, very similar to a car. Your servicing will be judged, the frequency of your servicing will be judged on the number of miles your car undertakes. Okay, so autoclaves and cars are very similar in that sense of things, and that's the way to think about it. A service is in accordance with manufacturer's instructions, generally based on how often you use that piece of equipment. Okay, the general consensus a lot of people abide by is having a service done every 12 months, but check your manufacturer's instructions, see what they state, because they may state more frequent, or they may state fewer servicing. Okay, so there's a degree of flexibility when it comes to the regulatory requirement to service and maintain your equipment. That will be dependent on what the manufacturer state is required for that. So there's no blanket time frame. Every piece of equipment will vary slightly different. Okay. However, the examination, so the pressure system safety regulations, this is equivalent to your MOT. Okay. So your MOT is a legal binding document, and you must not be driving your car without an MOT that's passed. Okay. Your examination is no different to an MOT in relation to your autoclaves and compressors. You must not be using that piece of equipment without an examination report that has deemed it fit and safe for continued use. Okay. So if you are using an autoclave or compressor without an examination report, essentially you shouldn't be. So you need to get one of those in place. Also, it's important to mention that examination reports are generally a requirement of your insurance providers. So if this is something you haven't got in place at the moment, I would advise that you check your insurance providers and establish what their expectations are, because you don't want to put yourselves in the position where your autoclave or compressor malfunctions and causes injury or damage to the property, and that nil and voids your insurance because you haven't got your examination report in place for it. Okay, so again, that's the main difference between them. A service, you got a bit of flexibility around. An examination report is quite strict on what you must and must not do. Okay, so make sure you got your examination report and prioritize that over everything else. The other element that is not included on this slide, but I just want to cover off, is validation. Okay, so a validation, and this doesn't relate to compressors, this just relates to autoclaves that we're talking about here in this webinar. A validation is required to ensure that that piece of equipment is sterilizing your instruments correctly. Okay, so a service is to maintain it in an efficient working order to avoid unwanted breakdowns. An examination is to make sure that piece of equipment is safe for use, and a validation is to ensure that that autoclave is sterilizing your instruments correctly. Validation is a requirement of HTM, so it falls under your best practice guidelines. Okay. So just to summarize that, you must maintain equipment in good working order, follow your manufacturer's recommendations to achieve compliance with that. Okay. A written scheme of examination must be in place for any new autoclave or compressor before you start using it. You must then undertake a follow-up examination known as a PVI, okay? And that the frequency of that is in accordance with the written scheme. However, the general rule is that autoclaves need an examination no more than every 14 months, and a compressor needs an examination no more than 26 months. But check your written scheme of examination just to ensure there's no differences in what I've just said, okay? You must not use pressure vessels beyond the dates stated in the examination report. So whether that's the written scheme or your follow-up examinations, they will have a date within it that states that you should not use that equipment. So make sure you take note of that and book in your re-examinations before that date expires. Any remedial actions identified in the examination report must be addressed. So these are not recommendations. Sometimes you get recommendations, but other times you will get remedial actions. So again, just like your MOT certificate, if you think about a car, they won't let you have that car back and drive it on the road if you need three tires replaced because they're bald. It's unsafe, so they won't allow you to use that car. Okay, so exactly the same. If there's remedial actions, you have to get those addressed before you put that piece of equipment back into use. And the last one, then, sterilizer validations, as I mentioned. That needs to be carried out at installation and annually thereafter, and that comes from HTML 105. So that's your best practice guidance to ensure that the sterilization process is efficient and working correctly. Okay. So electrical safety, portable appliance testing and electrical installation testing. Okay, so are these legally required? Within themselves, they're not. Okay, so if someone says to you that PAT testing is a legal requirement and an electrical installation test is a legal requirement, fundamentally they're incorrect, because there's no statutory obligation that says that you must undertake PAT. Okay, this comes from the British standard BS 7671. Okay, they both refer to the requirements to do this testing. Okay, however, before you go off and cancel your PAT testing and electrical testing regimes, it's important to note what the statutory requirement is. So this comes from the Electricity at Work regulations. And it states in that all electrical equipment must be constructed and maintained to prevent danger. So that's your statutory obligation. And this is where PAT testing and electrical installation testing comes into play. Because, as I said at the beginning of this webinar, a British standard is a standardized way of doing something to achieve best practice expectations. Okay, so everyone uses this BS 7671 to be able to evidence compliance that the electrical systems within the building are being maintained and safe. If you don't follow British standards, it would be quite difficult to evidence compliance with that statutory requirement by another means. Okay. So again, the quotes from inspectors on this topic is that portable appliance testing undertaken in 2020. However, no further testing has been done. Okay, so they are looking that you maintain some sort of testing regime, but they're not dictating the frequency. Okay, fixed wire testing, okay, had not been carried out since 2010. So again, they did it once, but they haven't done it again. So they're not routinely maintaining their systems. Okay, so we can see a bit of a trend there, that they're just looking for mechanisms that you've put in place to ensure that you're fulfilling your statutory obligation. Okay. So just to elaborate on this a little bit more, okay, when I refer to the testing of your electrical installation, that's commonly referred to as a fixed wire test, okay? The formal and correct terminology is an electrical installation condition report, EICR, okay? This involves the testing of all your fixed electrical services within your building, okay? So everything that conducts electricity around the premises, such as main fuse panels, your distribution boards, your socket outlets, okay? So that's your fixed wiring, the wiring behind the walls, what you can visibly see. PAT testing then, portable appliance testing, is any electrical item that needs to be plugged into a fixed installation, such as a wall socket, and is connected via a flexible cable and plug. Okay, so kettles, irons, monitors, laptops, all those sort of things, laptop chargers even. Okay, so electrical installation is the mains wiring. Portable is everything that then plugs into that mains wiring. Okay, so again, as I just mentioned, even though there's no statutory obligation to undertake these, without having these in place, it would be difficult for you to evidence compliance with your statutory obligation to maintain electrical systems and prevent danger. Okay, so that's why this comes in, because there is no real alternative out there to this at the moment. There's no real alternative ways to demonstrate compliance with that other than getting these undertaken. Okay, so they go hand in hand. Whilst people can't say the PAT is a legal obligation, you do have a legal obligation to maintain equipment. Okay, so that's where the link is with them. And as I said, you are free to follow other avenues from the British standards, but in the sense of maintaining electrical equipment, it's quite difficult to do that if you haven't got these in place. Okay. So something else I want to cover is the use of extension leads in the practice. I've seen on other health and safety and fire risk assessments, I'm not going to name companies, I'll be unprofessional, but I have seen this come up quite a lot, where they are saying that you should not use extension leads and that you should get additional wall sockets installed and things like that. Okay, there's no law out there, or no piece of documentation out there that says that extension leads are unsuitable and cannot be used. You are free to use them, providing you manage them safely. Okay, so you can have an extension lead in place as long as you haven't got the cable trailing across the floor to create a trip hazard. You haven't got a long cable under a reception desk that's going to tangle along people's feet. You know, you can manage it. You can manage it and control it. But one of the biggest things that I've seen in my experience of doing risk assessments is that people, unfortunately, don't quite understand how to manage the load. So what I mean by load is the amount of appliances that you plug into an extension lead, and whether then that can equate to an overload and ignition risk or electrical hazard. Okay, so I just want to hopefully give you a little bit of help when it comes, if you are using extension leads, to try and identify where possibly you may be going wrong or how to better manage them moving forward. So what I've done here is I've broken down the sort of appliances that you'll typically find in a dental practice. Okay, and I've marked on here now the total power usage of those appliances. So that's referred to as amps. Okay, so that's what the A stands for, amps. Okay, so a standard wall socket, the maximum load capacity of that wall socket is 13 amps. Okay, so the low risk appliances in a dental practice is all like your computer equipment. They use less than 0.5 amps. So well below that 13 capacity, okay? And a small fridge as well. A lot of people assume that a fridge uses more power, but actually it doesn't. It only uses about 1.5 amps. Your medium risk appliances then consists of microwaves, portable radiators, toasters, vacuum cleaners. As you can see there, they all start to increase from about 4.5 to 9 amps, okay? And then your higher risk appliances then are your washing machines, tumble dryers, irons, kettles, your autoclaves. Okay, they all have pretty much the maximum load capacity from 10 amps to 13 amps. Okay, so if you are using extension leads, this is all about ensuring you recognize the usage of those appliances and plug them all in so they don't exceed that total 13 amp requirement. Okay, so just to do a little bit of an exercise on this, just to help you identify, how to manage them appropriately. You've got a standard 4-socket extension lead here, okay, and the little gauge goes from 0 to 13 amps, so 13 again being your maximum. But before I do this, it's also important to note that some extension leads have a reduced maximum capacity. Some are reduced down to 10 amps, okay? Your extension leads will state the maximum amp capacity, and it will be inscribed into the back of the extension lead. So please make sure before you do anything, before you start plugging appliances in, that you identify what that maximum load capacity is. And my advice is, if you've got an extension lead that has a reduced one, you replace that for the maximum. So just to lessen the confusion of when to try and manage appliances in your practice. Okay, so I'm going to plug in 4 appliances here. I've got a computer, a phone charger, printer, and a monitor. Everything you would find at your reception desk. And I can see that the total capacity of those 4 items is equates to only around 4.5 amps. So again, well below that 13 amp threshold. So again, as long as you're managing them safely, there's no harm in using extension leads in your practice. And if you can demonstrate an understanding of this to inspectors who may say, or other assessors who may say that you need to get rid of them, then actually you can quantify keeping them in place. If I was to replace the phone charger for a vacuum cleaner, okay, that equates to around about 12.5 amps. So again, I am below that 13 amp capacity, but I am near the threshold. So I just need to be careful then if I replace any other appliances. Okay, but where a lot of practices go wrong is predominantly in the staff room. Okay, I have seen so many times in the staff room extension leads where they've plugged in a kettle. Okay, a single kettle plugged into an extension lead will max out the capacity of that extension lead. It's 13 amps and your capacity is 13. But obviously, I don't think in my experience, people haven't understood that. So they'll plug in a kettle, and because it's a small appliance, they haven't factored in the capacity of the load. And therefore, they'll plug in other items as well, like a kettle, like a toaster, or an iron. And if you do that, that's going to exceed that 13 amps, and that's going to be where your risk is then. So if you use extension leads, make sure you know how to manage the load effectively with them and that you haven't got the wrong combination of appliances plugged in. So again, to summarize, you must maintain electrical equipment in good working order. An EICR should be carried out for fixed electrical services to help evidence compliance with your obligation. The frequency of an EICR should not exceed 5 years. Okay, so that's the maximum. A PAT test should be carried out for electrical appliances to again help compliance with your statutory obligation. However, the frequency of PAT testing is determined by the number of types of appliances you have in practice. Okay, so different appliances will require different timeframes of testing. A class 2 appliance, which is a low-risk appliance like a computer equipment, the guidance states that you could do a test every 2 to 4 years. However, a class 1 appliance, such as some kettles, the guidance will state that a PAT test should be undertaken every 1 to 2 years. So different appliances have different frequencies. Now, what the guidance states and where the annual PAT testing comes into play is that if you do a combined portable appliance test, so you do one portable appliance test that encompasses all your appliances, then that should be done at the lowest frequency, okay, to encompass those higher risk appliances. So generally, that's where the annual PAT comes into play, because you are combining all your appliances into one test. You could separate them out. There's no harm in you doing that, identifying all your high, medium, low risk appliances and getting testing done at those frequencies. But to be honest, that's just overcomplicating it. And when you consider how low the cost is of a PAT test, is it really worth trying to overcomplicate the matter and trying to separate all your appliances out and having them all done at different times? You are free to do that if you want, but the purpose of this is to explain the rationale behind the testing. Okay, and again, extension leads are suitable for use providing they and the load are being managed safely. Okay, so the last one I want to go into now is display screen equipment. Okay, in a previous employment, I oversaw this. I'm a trained DSE assessor, so this is very close to home with me. And there's a lot of confusion out there, especially in dentistry, about who is a DSE user. We've got monitors in pretty much every room in our practice. We've got them in surgeries, we've got them in the reception, in the PM office, in the TCO rooms. So which one of those employees is a DSE user? So the regulations define a DSE user as an employee who uses DSE equipment as a significant part of their work. And a DSE operator is a self-employed person who uses display screen equipment as a big part of their work. Okay, so it's quite important, first of all, to establish the definition. You've got a DSE user and a DSE operator. So a user is an employee, an operator is a self-employed person. I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide. Okay, this is further broken down in the approved code of practice. A DSE user or an operator is defined as a person who uses DSE for continuous periods of an hour or more and use DSE in this way daily. Okay, this also applies to part-time workers. So if you're only working 3 days a week, but when you are working, you're using DSE for continuous periods for every one of those days, you are defined as a DSE user. Okay, so to put this in perspective in the practice, a nurse who only uses the computer screen in the surgery intermittently between patient treatments would not be classed as a DSE user. Whereas a receptionist who is sat at that reception desk looking at that computer screen for continuous periods throughout the day, they would be classed as a DSE user. So you have to, in your practice, look at how different members of staff are using the computer and the periods to establish whether or not they are defined as a DSE user under these regulations. Okay, so it doesn't matter if they've got a computer screen, it's on how long they're using it and sat in front of that computer screen for consecutively. Okay, so eye tests. This comes up a lot then. Once you have defined who your DSE user is, you have a statutory obligation to provide them with eye tests following a request. So if they feel that they're getting fatigued by looking at a computer screen for too long, they're starting to get eye problems or visual discomfort, and they request an eye test, you are obliged to do that. Okay, and you must repeat those eye tests at regular intervals. Okay, so just on that front, there's a quick poll I want to do just to establish what you're currently doing at the moment. And let me just find the poll now. Right, there we go. So just quite intrigued on what you do with regards to eye tests, because there's lots of ways you can do it. You can do vouchers, you can reimburse them through expenses. So be quite keen to understand how you're managing this. Okay, so the next bit then is glasses. Okay, if following an eye test they have been specified glasses, then again you as the employer are obliged to contribute towards the costs of those glasses. But there are a few key things here that I need to establish. Okay, you're only obliged to contribute to glasses where they've been specified solely for use whilst at work, okay, relating to the tasks that are undertaken at work. If the person needs glasses for outside of work, in addition, you are not obliged to pay for the cost of them. So it's only where those glasses have been specified for use whilst at work, okay? And you are only obliged to pay towards a basic set of glasses. So a basic frame and a basic set of the prescribed lenses. Okay. If the employee wants a higher spec glasses, then they have to pay the additional cost to those glasses. Okay. So to summarize that, a user is an employee who uses DSE continuously for periods of an hour or more An operator is a self-employed person who uses DSE continuously. Eye tests must be provided following a request from a DSE user. Okay. However, unfortunately, eye tests do not apply to DSE operators under the regulations. So statutory, you have to provide them to employees, but not to the self-employed. Okay. You could have your own policy in place if you felt that was a bit unfair and spread that out to all your colleagues. But under the regulations, the eye test only apply to DSE users. Okay. Corrective eyewear then must be provided if the eye test identifies the need for it. But again, as we discussed, you are only responsible for a basic set of glasses. Okay. And then the last one then, so no more facts or fictions, but what I want to try and establish at the moment is something that we do as a business. And every month I do a trend analysis. I look through all the inspection reports from England and Wales to identify what they're looking at. And this is where I've got my quotes from that I've shown through the slides. Okay. So I just want to share this with you because it's an integral part of how we support our members and how we formulate our policies, procedures, and things like that. So the last 10 inspection reports I've looked at for England, here's an example of all the evidence and action trends on your screen. And as well, there's some quotes here that I've picked up that are recent, the last month or so. Okay, so I'll just leave that for a couple of seconds just for you to digest. I've got one for Wales as well, if there's any Welsh members on this webinar. Okay. So just whilst you're looking at that, I just want to put another poll up, just to understand whether or not you felt that the facts and fictions was helpful in any way, and whether you would like another episode of facts and fictions covering potentially different topics. So let me just get that up now. Okay, there we go. And then if I go to Wales on the slide, just for any Welsh members that may be present, you'll see they only had seven released reports for the last month. So that's why there's not 10 like England. Okay, but again, you can see the trends and what they're looking at and where the downfalls are, which are your action trends. Okay. So I'll leave that. Again, I said this recording, this webinar has been recorded. It'll go up on YouTube, so you can watch this again and digest this information a little bit more. Okay. So look, I hope you found that quite useful. I hope you felt that it's opened up a little bit of confusion and established the requirements behind what I discussed. And I'd like to finish there. But before we go into the Q&A, I'd just like to hand over to Alex O'Neill just to discuss a couple of offers that we are giving at the moment.
I'm trying to get on screen. Can you hear me, Reese?
Yes, I can hear you, Alex. You're on.
Oh, fantastic. I'm literally going to have to come in and then drop off because I've got a meeting that I need to be in. So I'm so sorry for just to pop my head in and everything. But I hope everyone really, really enjoyed that. I think having done presentations with this company for about 8 or 9 years, I've never seen anyone do something as great as your extension lead slide, Reese. So that is brilliant. Are there any specific health and safety topics that I would like covered on a future webinar? I think I'll skip that for now.
Yeah,
because that just came up. So, but I just wanted to take a minute. I'm just really interested. Firstly, I think we've got about 150 people left in the webinar, and we'll move on to Q&A quickly after this. But if anyone's got iComply at the moment but hasn't heard of iManage, could you just type me in our chat or in the Q&A? I'd just be really interested to see if people haven't heard of it. And I just wanted to just take 2 minutes because we've just opened up iManage again for May. We didn't expect it to be anywhere near as popular as it was last year, and we ended up taking about 50% more practices than we thought we would, and we're just about to break 100 practices on iManage. So we've opened it up again for May. I won't go into all of the details of it because they're on the screen and they're on the slide. but it's been a massive success in that people have essentially outsourced the majority of their compliance management to us, and what they've found is with the day's worth of time that they're getting back from us, essentially doing the majority of it for them, they've managed to either get family time back. A lot of people have got family time back, more time that they just wanted to be able to spend with their other half, quite often their partner, who they run the practice with. And what we've also found is people have managed to get really good return on investment, because it's only 239 a month, and freeing up a couple of days a month to focus on new patient acquisition, they've easily paid that off. So that was what we developed iManage as an investment, and it's been really successful in that. So I just wanted to take a second to say we're opening it up again for May. We're actually developing a small group offering. So if you've got 2 to 20 practices and you're interested in us helping you with your management, either at a compliance management, either at a practice level or at a group compliance level, then we're developing a product for that. And we've also developed a little package for new practices who don't have iComply, who want to come on board and are interested. New practices who haven't got iComply and want to come on board and are interested with iComply plus iManage, so sort of a total compliance solution to put a system in place, but also to offset and give you time to actually run the practice. So I think we just had a pop-up, but I'll ask, I think it's Tony today who's helping us out. Tony, if you could put the pop-up up again, that would be fantastic. Just one more time before I go. So if anyone's really interested in this, please click on it. Please book a demo, have a chat with our... I think there's a few places left for May. So have a chat with our new business team and they'll talk to you about that. So thank you. I appreciate everyone. I know it, just coming out of the blue and talking about this may have come out of nowhere for some people, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to tell people we were opening it up again, and also the other bits that we're doing with it. So Reese, I'm going to leave you to your Q&A, but fantastic webinar, and nice to see everyone very, very quickly. I'm designing. I'm working on another CQC webinar for some point in the future. So I'm sure I'll see everyone again soon. Take care.
Cheers, Alex. Thank you. Okay. Well, look, I run over a little bit, so apologies for that. But I can see there's a couple of questions in the Q&A now, so I'll go through them and try and answer as many as I can to not hold you up any longer than is necessary. So. First question here, our hot water flow is set at 60 degrees, but the furthest room from the combi boiler can't reach 50 degrees in 1 minute. It can take 2 minutes. Okay. So again, this is a common problem that I've come across. So look, this is where your systems, as I mentioned earlier, your systems may not be able to cope with the capacity or the demand or the layout of your premises. But the main thing that you've hit here is the storage temperature at 60 degrees. So essentially, you are killing the bacteria because that combi boiler is set at 60 degrees. So as it heats up the water, it's killing any bacteria within that system. Okay. If the water then is dropping below 55 degrees because of that extended distance that it's traveling, you need to just make sure that you are regularly flushing through those water lines, the pipe work that's connected to that. If that segment of pipe work is long and you're not using it regularly, or if there's any periods of the week where it may be not used for 24 hours, that could then create the stagnation risk within the pipe work. So where you're falling below that, just make sure then that you've got that regular turnover of water, that you're turning on all your taps regularly and flushing through the water for a good 3 minutes to make sure that it gets rid of any stagnation. But the primary thing you've got right there is the 60 degrees at the hot water source to kill any bacteria. Okay, so I hope that's answered your query, Sarah. Kim Payne, I've got a question here. I'd love to know how many dental practices in the last 10 years have been proved to be responsible for Legionnaires. Okay, so I'm guessing that's you're referring to where there's been Legionella cases. There hasn't, right? To be completely transparent on this, there hasn't been a known case of Legionella disease in a dental practice in the last decade, but there's been lots of examples and cases, and I've seen this as well, where there's been downfalls in the parameters that could potentially lead to a case of Legionella disease. So they've been intercepted before it's got to that stage. Okay, so this is why you mustn't get complacent with it and start thinking, oh, well, there's never been a case that we know of, so it's obviously not that risk. As I mentioned earlier, Legionella is a potential fatal form of pneumonia. So you don't want someone coming back or a claim being put in saying that I've contracted Legionella disease and you to then be investigated and then to show to see that you haven't done all these controls and you haven't tried to eliminate and manage that risk appropriately. Okay, so yeah, don't get complacent with it just because something hasn't happened. And that's pretty much the downfall in all health and safety. It's about being proactive and preventing things from happening rather than being reactive and waiting for something to happen and then putting the controls in place. Grenfell being your primary example of that. Just because there wasn't a fire for the last 100 years, everyone got a little bit complacent, and then look what happened. And obviously that's enhanced all the requirements for cladding on buildings and things like that. Okay. So I got one here. Sita, what about Legionella testing for water cooling machines? So again, I'm assuming you're referring to your water dispensers that you've got for drinking water in the practice. If you've got a bottle-fed water system, they don't apply, okay, because the water is being delivered in that secure sealed water bottle, okay. If you've got a plumbed-in water dispenser that goes into your main system, again, they don't normally apply because when they install and plumb in that system, they will install a filter. Okay, so when the water leaves your mains water system and goes into the water cooler, it's being filtered. So it's getting rid of all that bacteria at the point of it going into your water dispenser. Okay, so as long as you were getting those filters changed regularly and you were maintaining your water cooler in accordance to the manufacturer's instructions, you were fine. You were doing everything that's required. Okay. But again, I have seen water coolers that have been in place for years and years, and no one's changed the filters, no one's done anything, and that's when your risk could apply then, because if those filters break down, then potentially the bacteria will get into it. So just maintain your water coolers, dispensers in accordance of the instructions, manufacturer's instructions, and you will fill in your obligations in that sense. Okay. So a couple here on eye tests. Tony's put, we are not asked for an eye test if they wear glasses. Should we contribute to their test? And that's come up a few times. So essentially, if, like myself, I already wear glasses. However, if I'm working and I'm starting to get pain in my eyes, I can request an eye test from Agilio, and they will have to provide me with that test. Okay. So it doesn't matter if I wear glasses or not. If I request an eye test voucher, as an employer, you are obligated to provide one, okay? However, you're not obligated to contribute to the glasses that I'm already wear, but if as a result of that eye test, the optician says that I need a different pair of glasses solely for use at work, then you are required to contribute to the cost towards those. But if, like me, I wear glasses for work, I wear them when driving, I wear them outside, as an employee, you're not responsible for contributing to them. So it's only where the glasses have been specified for use at work, okay? So again, just to summarize, if I go to the optician and they say that the glasses I got are suitable and I need to wear them at all times, as an employee, you're not obliged to pay. But if the optician says I need a different pair of glasses from when I'm working, then you're obliged to contribute towards those glasses. Okay, so I hope that clarifies that up. Okay. All right. So I'm just seeing now it's going to. Right, so I've got here, Danielle's put a question on here, and it's a good question as well. Is it correct that if individual water heaters do not store or have storage tanks less than 15 liters, they do not require temperature checks, okay? Especially if in very regular use or regularly flushed if little used, okay? So, right, okay, so These are called instantaneous water heaters or point of use water heaters. Very small water heaters, usually installed underneath the sink, directly below the taps. Okay, cold water pipe goes in. There's a coil system inside that heats the cold water, and then it produces your hot water at the outlet. Okay, those are classed as very low risk systems. So if they're the only mechanism for heating up your water in your system, they are very low risk. However, you are still required to take the temperature recording at the outlets to make sure that that water heater is operating effectively. So the guidance states, the HSG 274 and the HTMs state that those point of use heaters, okay, anything under 15 liters must still operate effectively and must still distribute water at 55 degrees. So yes, you still need to record the temperatures to ensure that they're working efficiently. If you taking the water temperatures and they're under 55 degrees, that will tell me that those water heaters are not operating effectively, and you may need to get them changed. Okay, so yeah, you still need to test the water temperatures for them. Okay, Liz Johnson, water temperature in disabled facilities. Okay, so this is, I didn't cover it earlier, but this is a very valid point. Okay, the higher the water temperature, the higher the risk of scalding at those outlets. Okay, so where vulnerable people have got access to water outlets, so disabled toilets, okay, as a mechanism to control that potential scalding risk, you should get something installed which is called a TMV, a thermostatic mixing valve. It's a little device that fits below the taps. The cold water goes into one side of it, the hot water goes into the other side. It blends the water to around 41 degrees and then sends that blended water up to your hot water outlet. Okay, so where you have got vulnerable people and disabled toilets, you should have a TMV installed to lower that temperature recording. Okay, where you've got those TMV installed and the temperature of the water is lower, then yes, you're not going to be able to, when you take your temperature recordings, achieve that 55. But that's because of that blended valve that's installed. Okay, so again, as long as you know where you've got those blended valves and you're able to communicate that to inspectors or contractors who may then question you on why that particular tap is under 55, that's absolutely fine. Because at the end of the day, that's the purpose of it. Okay, so as long as all the other taps in your practice that haven't got that blended valve installed are operating at 55, that's absolutely fine. Okay. So what have we got here? So a couple more now. Okay, so there's a disagreement between the Legionella documentation we have and the inspector. Should the 55 degrees be reached after 1 or 2 minutes of running the tap? The guidance all states after 1 minute. Okay, so that's the guidance. You should be able to achieve 55 after 1 minute. Okay, again, as I discussed, there's parameters around that while you may not be able to do it. So you need to look at your water system and how that is efficiently working or not working. Can you adjust the thermostat? Can you improve the flow rate to be able to get it to that? There's a few variables that may affect it, but essentially, as long as your hot water unit is operating at 60 degrees, those variables, there's flexibility on how you can achieve it and whether or not you can justify to inspectors on the rationale and the reasons why you can't hit that mark. Okay. Okay, what was the PV volume requirement for testing? So again, the PV volume requirement relates to compressors, and it's compressors under 250 bar litre. If they're under 250 bar litre, they don't fall under the statutory obligation to get a thorough examination or PVI undertaken. If they're over 250 bar litre, then they fall under that statutory obligation. Okay. Okay, so we have an external Legionella risk assessment done 2 years ago now. Assessment done 2 years ago and is now due to be renewed. Nothing has changed in the building. We don't require any actions. Do I and I do regular assessments myself. Do we need another external assessment? In a nutshell, no, you don't. As long as you can justify that you will review that assessment, and you can justify to assessors or inspectors who may ask you that everything has remained the same, then you don't need it to be redone. You only need it to be redone when there's been a change to your water system. Okay, so like I said, if you had a refurbishment, renovation, if you've moved a sink from one room to another, then that changes the system and you need a new one. But if everything has remained the same and you are comfortable in reviewing that assessment yourself, you don't need it to be redone. Okay, so I think that's everything that I can answer now. Just seeing if there's anything else. Okay, some of our nurses work on reception one, sometimes 2 a week. Would they still need a DSE assessment? So in relation to DSE assessments, every workstation, regardless of whether a DSE user or DSE operator, needs to be assessed to make sure that it is suitable and it complies to regulations, that you've got the correct chairs, your monitors are at the correct height, and the environment is suitable. So you need to assess your workstations regardless of who's using them, okay, and regardless of how often they're using them. In relation to eye tests, you need to determine whether that person is a DSE user. Are they using equipment for sufficient periods of the working day or working week to justify them being to classify them as being a DSE user? And if you feel that they are, then they would fall under the obligation to give them an eye test. Okay. Right. Okay. How long do you need to keep Legionella records for? Okay. Okay. So your water temperature logs, Legionella assessments, there is a requirement. You're testing my memory now. I can't remember off the top of my head. There is a requirement, but I can't remember off the top of my head. So, Georgina, I will need to get back to you on that. If you're a member of iComply, we recently released a records retention document, and it had the Legionella records within that. So if you are a member, you can refer to our records retention document, and that will establish the details. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, sorry. Right, I think I will leave it there because I've held you up for long enough now. We've gone half an hour over, so apologies for that. Again, hope you found it useful. Hope that's the sort of thing that you were looking for, and I wish you a great afternoon and the rest of your day. Thank you.